You are probably using your custom buttons wrong. Let me explain why. Most people will unbox their camera, dig through the menu settings, set up all their custom buttons, and then completely never touch it again or touch it every now and then. Today, what I'm going to advocate for you to do is set up what I'm calling a dynamic custom button. Essentially, it's a custom button that is fluid in its functionality. So you're always going to program this custom button to whatever your shooting needs are at the time. Now, this can be used for all types of photography, be that event photography, wildlife photography. There are so many different ways that you can use a dynamic button to get the most out of whatever situation you're in. So in this video, I'm going to share 6 different functions that I use that are applicable to a broad range of situations that get the most out of your camera and make it way more easy and convenient while shooting. Now, the first setting that I'm going to advocate for is what I'm calling the oh shit button. Essentially, we use the recall custom function setting in the Sony cameras to press and hold a button, and it just recalls a complete settings list. So essentially, it's like your custom settings on the top there. It saves your custom settings, and when you press and hold that button, it completely defaults to that. So you could set this up to be aperture priority, auto everything, or you could set it up to be shutter priority, auto everything. Or for me, often I use a slow shutter oh shit button. So I can quickly go from getting regular photos with no motion blur to quickly holding that down, getting a few slow shutter pans in really quickly and easily. This works great if you're just trying to get those slow shutter moody shots, or if you're on like a long exposure setting, but something cool is happening, you just want to quickly capture it. Makes it perfect to be able to quickly switch and flick to that. This can even be used in like wildlife situations where maybe you're taking photos of birds in flight and you want a really high shutter speed to be able to capture that motion, but then the bird lands and you don't want to compromise your exposure triangle for such a high shutter speed when they're just sitting still. You could program your oh shit button to be a lower shutter speed by default so that you can get a better exposure triangle for that given situation. The second situation that I program my dynamic custom button for is for when you're doing astrophotography. There's a function in the camera called bright monitoring that I set it to. That essentially just opens up the sensor to capture in as much light as possible so that you can work on your composition even in the darkest of situations. Now, when you move the camera, it's gonna have some motion blur, so it's not something you have on all the time, but it just allows you to get your composition right, make sure you focus before you start taking photos. So whenever I'm going out for anything remotely night or star-based, I will always set that to bright monitoring. Now, the next situation that I change my dynamic custom button for is whenever I'm doing an event or any situation that requires flash photography. Now, for me and many people that use flashes, TTL is sort of the way to go. It's almost like the auto of flashes. Essentially, TTL will take a small burst of flash and then calculate through the camera what exposure the flash needs to be set at in order to balance the exposure result in the camera. Now, what that means is that your ambient settings for your camera need to be darker if you want a brighter flash, for example, or if you want a really weak flash, they need to be a bit brighter. Now, when you plug in a flash to a camera, the camera is going to show a absolutely perfect exposure, even though for ambient light, it actually might be under or overexposed. That's kind of an issue because it doesn't give you a clear indication of what the flash is going to do without test shooting. So I set my dynamic custom button whenever I'm using a flash to be on shot result preview. Essentially, it's a button I can hold down really quickly and it will show me if the flash wasn't involved, what is the shot going to look like? That can allow me to determine, am I underexposed enough to get decent light output from the flash, or do I need to change my exposure to get the flash result I'm desiring? This makes using TTL on a flash way easier, way less headaches. You don't have to be constantly adjusting the TTL exposure compensation on the flash. You can just do it all in camera settings. Way easier. Now, speaking of portraits, as you would with a flash, whenever I'm doing portraiture photography or I want to be really specific in where my focus is on an eye, I will set my dynamic custom button to be a left-right eye switch for eye autofocus. This is really important because sometimes your subject might be on an angle and you want to make sure that your autofocus is catching the right eye, because we're all using eye autofocus nowadays. It's super convenient, but being able to control which eye it is, like being able to move around your focus point, is super important. So whenever I'm doing anything portraiture related, that's what my dynamic custom button is. Also, when shooting events, there's often situations where you're required to shut your camera the f up. That's why often in event photography or any situation where I know I won't want to make too much noise or draw attention to myself, I'll often set my dynamic custom button to be silent shooting. That way I can quickly switch between silent shooting and mechanical shutter. That way I can maximize my results and make sure I'm not disrupting anyone. I'm doing photos for behind the scenes for TV crews and that sort of thing, and having a silent switch to make sure that you're not fucking up their audio for the interview is super clutch. Nice and quickly being able to access that without having to dig through the menus is always going to be better. And the last thing that I might set my dynamic custom button to is my minimum shutter speed for auto ISO. When you're in variable light conditions and you don't want to be faffing about with manual, happens sometimes, aperture priority or shutter priority, having the auto ISO minimum shutter speed just gives you a little bit more control over your exposure triangle, just to make sure you're getting the right motion blur required for the scene. It's just one of those things that it's a lot easier to quickly access it from one button and change it. Now, I hope that's given you some ideas on how to set up your custom buttons. Now, I'm not saying do this to all of your custom buttons. That would be absolutely insane. Just 1 or 2 custom buttons. Just think about what you want to do. Now, personally, I use a C3 button because it's really out of the way while you're shooting. So you can just like quickly press that and change your setting. But it's out of the way. It's not one of the functions that's really accessible that you want to use all the time and have as a fixed function. Also, I set my AEL as my oh shit button because it's nice and near the AF on button so that you can just quickly hold it and get that same effect. Now, if this has given you any ideas of what you would use your dynamic custom button for that I haven't mentioned, please leave it in the comments below. I'm always looking for ways to get the most out of my cameras, and this is just one of those awesome ways you can do it. Now, if you've enjoyed this video here, I think you'll enjoy this video where I go over the best pocket camera for everyday photography and getting a camera into situations where you normally wouldn't bring like your full frame, heavy, bulky setup. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you in the next one.